My name is Eloy Escagedo Gutierrez. I write it as Escagedo III in Roman numerals, or as the Third. I share the same first and last name as my father and grandfather. I was taught to add the third when I was a boy and have written it that way ever since. In the U.S., it's common to use the first and last name with the maternal name omitted. Also, married women take their husband's surname. In Spain, however, it's more common for people to use both the paternal and maternal names, and wives retain their family surname. Throughout history, Escagedo was spelled with a G, J, or an X. The surname would be recorded this way depending on how the scribes and notaries decided to write it, but phonetically, these three letters sound the same. Today you would find the name spelled with either a G or a J, where the X had fallen out of favor sometime in the 1600s. Currently there's only a handful of Escagedo in Miami, and we're all related. The surname is rare here, not too common around the world. Searching over the web, there are a few hundred instances of it accounted for. All of us Escagedo today descend from the same ancestors and locations back in the past. At least that's the case with those that I have researched. Almost all Escagedos can be found in Cantabria, Spain, then spreading in smaller numbers around the world. Presently, there's Escagedo in Spain, Argentina, Brazil, and the United States that we're aware of. In the past, Escagedos were documented in Cuba, Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, and Peru. I trace my direct branch here in the United States since the early 1960s, back to Cuba in the early 1900s, and then to Spain through my grandfather, born in 1911, and from there into the 1800s. I grew up aware of a fair amount of family history, but till recently I thought there was no one left of the Escagedos, except for the few of us here in Miami and maybe a couple of cousins in Spain. I was told the following history by my father and grandfather when growing up. My great-grandfather, Felix Escagedo Salmon, had died in a tram car accident, and his wife, my great-grandmother, Eloisa Valle Fernandez, had died young, giving birth to my grandfather, Eloy Escagedo Valle. But in light of my research, I now believe that Eloisa either died giving birth to Balbina Escagedo Valle, or possibly at a later date. My father also told me that there was a second sister, Antonia, though I've not been able to discover more of her story. They also explained that my grandfather lived with his aunt, Benita, and her brother, Mateo Escagedo Salmon. Mateo was a priest, historian, and genealogist. My grandfather traveled with him as he worked on documenting the history, peoples, towns, and villages of Cantabria. Mateo was the official chronicler of the province of Santander. At a young age, with the encouragement of his uncle, my grandfather would begin studying for the priesthood. But Eloy decided to leave his studies, and a mutual decision was made to send him to Cuba, where Gregorio Escagedo Salmon, his other uncle, was living. Eloy Escagedo Valle was 18 years old in 1930 when he departed for Cuba. In the years since the passing of my parents, I have been working on the family tree. I've been poring through records and reviewing family photos that are now in my care. In 2000, there was a great flood here in Sweetwater, Florida. The water spilled out of the canal into the streets and into many houses, including ours. At the time, I was in Los Angeles. When I returned home, my father explained that he had spent the night of the storm holding a plywood board against the window which had shattered, and it was blowing wind and rain indoors. He said that for days my grandmother Ramona and her dog Cucuyo sat on the couch away from the water as if on a makeshift island. He mentioned that he had done his best to salvage as many documents and photos as he could, but many were ruined. My father had kept these items in boxes for years after, and one day I suggested we store them in albums, which we did. Back then in the early 2000s, possibly 2011 or earlier, I was also in touch with my cousin Luis Escagedo Gavia from Spain. He's the son of Juan Escagedo Gomez and Blanca Gavia. I had reached out to him over the internet, and though we shared some family stories, we both enjoyed more conversations about music rather than genealogy. In 2014, I began to correspond with my cousin Milagros Escagedo Blanco. Her father was Celestino Escagedo Gomez, one of 12 children born to Vicente Pedro Escagedo Salmon and Manuela Gomez Santamaria. Milagros lives in Cantabria, Spain, right there where my grandfather Eloy was from. She has a lovely family with whom I've had the pleasure of sharing and talking with on many occasions. Now, I was very surprised to learn that I had many more cousins in Spain as opposed to what I had previously thought. With her help, we would begin to piece together the family tree, but that would not start in earnest until a few years later, around 2018. Milagros and I are cousins, and as with Luis Alberto, we share a recent common ancestor through Diego Millán Escagedo Mier and Balbina Salmon Escagedo, my second great-grandparents. Millán was from Bo de Mortera, and Balbina was from Maliaño. They had 7 children: Juan, Mateo, Feli, my great-grandfather, Benita, Pedro, grandfather of Milagros, Fernando, and Gregorio Escagedo Salmon, the grandfather and great-grandfather to cousins currently living here in America as well as in Spain. Around 2018, my good friend Steve Nealon, who I met through the online woodworking maker community, set me up with a guest account on Ancestry after seeing my interest. He taught me how to use the software, which allowed me to organize my family documents, and this helped me to think in a methodical way about genealogy research. After that, Milagros and I began a family book project for the Escagedo Salmon family. She translated all my writings into Spanish and wrote biographies for the Escagedo Gomez family. I also included genealogy research my father had left on his computer just before his passing from around 2008. The writings he left included biographies of his father and mother's ancestors, as well as the Escagedo Garcia family. As the weeks progressed, we continued to learn more and added missing branches to the tree. Through Milagros, I met my cousin Maribel Sierra Escagedo, who lives in Maliaño. The 3 of us shared many calls together recounting family stories. Maribel also provided us with documents and photos that are currently in her care, as well as additional photos from her family members. She's the daughter of Fernando Sierra Hernandez and Serapia Escagedo Gomez. As with Milagros, our most recent common ancestors are Diego Millán and Balbina. Later, through Milagros, I also met José Román Cavia Soto. His surname Cavia is from Maliaño, with family ties to surnames such as Soto, Sierra, Valle, Escagedo, and Casuso, among others. José is our mutual cousin from Spain, and we share our most recent common ancestor through Agustín Escagedo and Antonia Mier. Jose is a professional photographer, and along with his own extensive genealogy research, he took pictures of the cemeteries, mausoleums, and headstones around many hamlets throughout the province of Santander. I was also introduced to Mónica and Elena Escagedo Cotera from Spain, and they too provided family photos from their collections. In one of their photos, I was lucky to find the only other known picture of my great-grandfather Felix. I also received help from Beatriz Escagedo Carreras, Beatriz Sarraluki Escagedo, Rosa Escagedo Gutierrez, and Cristina Escagedo Suárez Bustamante. Francisco Vicente Escagedo also sent us photographs and shared his incredible family story. With help from cousins, friends, and countless hours of investigative work, we have been able to piece together a lot of the Escagedo story. Most of the story would have been scattered or maybe lost if not for all of their efforts, so thank you to our family from Spain, Brazil, and Miami. I was born at Mercy Hospital in Miami, Florida in 1975. That's my mother, Berta Maria Gutierrez Jimenez, with me in her arms. Luckily, my father had an 8mm film camera and recorded a lot of the footage back then. We lived in Sweetwater, Dade County, Florida, in an old house built in 1949. It sits on the corner of the block in front of the Tamiami Canal. Here's footage from 1971 of how the home looked when my parents first moved in. That's how it appeared when I was growing up as well. I remember the furniture and decor just like it was yesterday. My parents, Eloy Escagedo Lliraldi and Berta Maria Gutierrez, married on August 14, 1971, at St. Peter and Paul's Church in Miami. Both born in Cuba, he was from Aguada de Pasajeros, Las Villas, born November 14, 1942, and she was from Colón, Matanzas, born May 13, 1951. As Cuba fell into a dictatorship in the 1960s, they had left for the U.S. Eloy left without his parents at the age of 20 and joined the Army. and Berta left with her parents, Águeda Jiménez Hernández and Luis Gutiérrez Jiménez, and her sister, María del Carmen. Eloy and Berta met in Miami when picking up their mothers from the factory they both worked at sewing. This is my grandmother Ramona Facunda Lliraldi Alvarez. Next to her is my great aunt on my mother's side, Berta Gutiérrez Jiménez. My grandmother giving me a bath. My great aunt Cuca Evangelina Lliraldi Alvarez. My grandmother Águeda Jiménez Hernández. My grandfather Luis Gutiérrez Jiménez. And my grandfather Eloy Escagedo Valle. I was born into a family and community exiled from their country. They had lost everything, yet despite that they were filled with dignity and love, which I was blessed to receive. One evening when I was young, we were visiting my grandparents in Little Havana, here in Miami. As we said goodnight on the curb, my father said to me, "You are American." And I looked at him and smiled, and then he said, "I'm Cuban." And I looked at him curiously, and he said to me, "And grandfather is a Spaniard." At that moment, I began to cry. They were humored and must have understood my reaction. I was too young and could not understand. I now smile when I remember that moment. That's the first time they had mentioned the journey of the Escagedo family across generations, and it's the reason I have taken on this project, my desires to honor their memory. In 1983, my grandparents, Eloy and Ramona, then retired, moved into the house that they had built on the same lot where we lived in Sweetwater. Those were happy times for us all, and I remember lunchtime on the weekends. My father would be working on his book La Conciencia También es Gris. My mother would be on the phone with family and friends. Next door, my grandmother Ramona would be preparing food in the kitchen as she would do each weekend. And I would sit on the front porch with my grandfather Eloy, who would tell me of his life in Cantabria, Spain. He'd tell me of the journeys with his uncle Mateo Escagedo Salmon, the priest, historian, and chronicler of genealogy. He'd recall his visits to the caves and mountains of his country, and his dog Lobo, who was as white as snow. He explained that he had started to study for the priesthood with the encouragement of his uncle, but changed his mind, and that he had then agreed with his uncle Mateo to immigrate to Cuba. As we talked, Ramona yelled out that lunch was ready, and we'd all gather around the table. My family tree goes back to Spain and from different parts of the peninsula, through the various branches. Those recent ancestors made their way to the New World to Cuba in the last 100 years or so. I also have ancestors from one branch that are Italian who also made their way to Cuba. My paternal grandfather was from Cantabria. My paternal grandmother descends from Italians and Cubans. My maternal grandfather's family was from Malaga, and my mother's maternal side was from the Canary Islands. I'd like to see how far back we can trace our paternal Escagedo surname itself. There's a lot of sites online with historical records, and I've taken advantage of those resources, but I've had to get creative to dig deeper. So I've studied other documents, census rolls, and church records, obituaries, books, including some of those written by my great-granduncle Mateo. Luckily, Spain preserves much of their historical records online, and I have poured through those for years now. I've created a timeline going back into the distant past to the earliest mention of the name, which occurs back in the 1200s. Then the accounts appear again in the 1500s and on through to current times with gaps along the way. Those would be our ancestors, but we're not aware of exactly how they connect to our known paper trail from the 1800s. There's a wealth of record keeping back in the past, and it's incredible to have the information that we have discovered. The surname may very well be toponymic. For instance, the word escajo is similar to escagedo, and it refers to a plant or thorny bush. There are a few family lines from the past with compound surnames such as Gutiérrez de Escagedo, Sánchez de Escagedo, Rodríguez de Escagedo, and Díaz de Escagedo. Likewise, we find the Escagedo name recorded on its own back then as well. Those compound surnames were recorded in places such as Ucieda and Ruente from the 1600s through the 1700s. There's also a casona in Ucieda called Palacio de Escagedo, which is still standing, but no one knows much more of who occupied it in the past. These compound surnames are no longer in use, and we now only find the Escagedo name. Although these accounts are found in the same hamlets and having the same family surnames as our own ancestors, we currently trace our documented line back to Agustín Escagedo and Josefa Antonia Mier, born around 1800. And that's thanks to Milagros Escagedo Blanco because of her visit to the civil registry in Maliaño. She managed to find the birth certificates of many of the Escagedos, including my great-grandfather Patricio Feli Escagedo Salmon. So what have we been able to find beyond our documented ancestors concerning this surname? Surnames of the ancient families of Caravaca from the first Christian populations verified by the kings Fernando III and Sancho IV. In a book called Memories of the History of the City of Caravaca by Agustín de Espinosa in 1856, the Escagedo surname appears among the first Christian families to inhabit the town after retaking it from Muslim rule in the 1200s. This list of family names being verified by the kings Ferdinand III and Sancho IV. Once a city or town was taken back by Christians, they would send people from the north to repopulate it. This was the case in addition to Christians that were already living under Muslim rule. In the book El Real Valle de Cahuérniga, published in 1924 by Mateo Escagedo Salmon, Volume 1, page 18, in 1508, Juan de Mier y Terán created his last will and testament, leaving lands in Renedo to the children and heirs of Domingo Escagedo. Domingo would have been born in the mid to latter half of the 1400s, possibly, but this is estimated from how the text was written by Mateo Escagedo Salmon, and we're not sure. There's also a Juan Gutiérrez de Escagedo that would have lived in the same time period. Either way, this would make them the earliest full names that we know of for the Escagedo surname. We do have the descendants for Juan Gutiérrez de Escagedo, but we're not aware of Domingo's descendants, those that received the inheritance through Juan de Mier y Terán. 100 years later, we have documents from Cahuérniga in 1619, litigated by Juan Díaz de Bustillo, where a Juan de Escagedo is also involved. The document has not been transcribed for easy reading. Considering the related place name of Cahuérniga in this document, it may very well be that Juan de Escagedo could have been descended from Domingo generations later. But this is speculation. But we do know that the surname continued to appear there through the centuries. Moving forward 64 years in 1574, Juan de Escagedo was living in Valladolid. He was originally from Renedo and went through the process of testing his nobility. Juan was from a direct line of men of the manor house of the Escagedos located in Renedo in the Piélagos Valley. He married María López del Mazo, and their children were Juan Alonso María Antonia, who was born in 1562, and Francisco Escagedo, who was born in 1568. Friar Juan de Escagedo was born in Valladolid along with his siblings. He was a priest in the Order of Santo Domingo, in the Covenant of Santa María de Atocha in Madrid. His brother Alonso was born in 1561, and there is a christening document from August 15th of that same year. Alonso left for Mexico at a young age of about 20. There's also a passenger license for Friar Juan from June 20th, 1606, to travel to New Spain. In 1615, Friar Juan went through the steps to prove his nobility as his father had done before him. He was 40 years of age at the time. His father, Juan de Escagedo Landaburu, had been deceased in Valladolid for 34 years, and his mother had passed away 18 years prior in Seville. We also have documentation of Alonso de Escagedo López in San Matías, Sierra de Pinos, Mexico, through the years 1619 and 1630. His wife was Inés de Ávila. In these entries, Alonso appears as witness and godfather for various marriages. Recently, I found a record from Renedo de Piélagos from 1821. It's curious that the Escagedo name appears there again centuries later. There are two Renedos, one in Cahuérniga and one in Piélagos. It is unclear to me if one was established from the name of the other. Are there family connections through the descendants of Domingo back in 1574 and these Escagedos? I believe there might very well be. In any case, in the Renedo parish records of 1821, under confirmations, we find Manuela, Juana, Antonio, and Agustín Escagedo. Parents, Francisco Escagedo and Teresa Acereda. I believe that this Agustin is likely to be my third great-grandfather. I have searched records for this first and last name combination for years, and it's difficult to come across the surname, and even rarer to discover both together. So I have some degree of confidence that this is our Agustin, but I need more documents to confirm it. Currently, I have Agustin documented through the birth certificates that Milagros had found at the civil registries in Maliaño, as well as the marriage of one of his sons, Pedro Escagedo Mier, who married Josefa Martínez Otero in Quijano on January 19, 1849. If we are correct and this is our Agustin, perhaps we could go further back in time with our tree. It's a matter of connecting relationships, and I'm still trying to find out more. I do have the impression that Mateo was documenting his ancestors as he researched the broader body of his work. I think that within the monumental task of gathering and preserving the history of his country, why wouldn't a genealogist of his caliber be curious about his own family origins? Mateo also left us the names of the ancestors of Friar Juan de Escagedo and his siblings, Alonso, María Antonia, and Francisca, parents Juan de Escagedo and María López del Mazo, grandparents Juan de Escagedo and María Landaburu, great-grandparents Juan Gutiérrez de Escagedo and María Ibáñez, great-great-grandparents Juan Gutiérrez de Escagedo and Elvira Gutiérrez de Rucababo. In the book Yecla en el siglo XVII by Juan Blázquez Miguel on page 67, there's interesting information as well. Although it's a small passage, it figures in the life of Friar Juan de Escagedo's forefathers describing his grandparents. It reads, at a young age, Juan de Escagedo went to live in Bilbao. There he met a young maid of his house, María de Landaburu, with whom he had a romance with, of which the grandmother had been surprised to find them involved in by the vineyards. Juan de Escagedo Landaburu was born out of this romance. At the age of 30, he became a priest with little vocation so that he could acquire benefits in Renedo, where he had an ancient building without towers next to a river. On March 24, 1585, there was a payment letter by Toribio de Escagedo as representative of Juan Hernández de la Castañera, Simón de Hermoa, and Fernando Sánchez de Mortera, along with all the residents of Barcelona, to Bartolomé and Agustín del Barco from Bilbao in the amount of 20 ducats for their service as estibadores. Their work was likely loading and unloading cargo from a ship. On November 4th, 1591, there was a lease granted to Catalina de Escagedo by María Ortiz de Retes, the maid of María Sánchez de Urizar, on her behalf, who was a neighbor of the Anteiglesia. Anteiglesia was the name used for communities organized around churches with certain local autonomy. Catalina de Escagedo was a neighbor and had a new house and bodega in Urizar, located in the parish. The lease was for 4 years and with an annual rent of 16 ducats. In 1614, Martín de Escagedo was a servant of the court for Francisco de Borja y Aragón. Francisco was Count of Rebolledo, Prince of Esquillace, Knight of Santiago, and Lord to the bedchamber to the king. In July 1614, Francisco de Borja was named Viceroy of Peru. He was in his 30s. He prepared and left Spain to occupy his charge the following year. He was accompanied by 174 people, including family, counselors, staff, and servants of his house. He also took with him Italian musicians, comedians, and Portuguese assistants. During his reign, his confidant would always be Martín de Escagedo. It was written that Martín came to Peru with the intent of enriching himself during Francisco's period of governance, of which Martín was well suited. The trust that the viceroy had in him was such that Martín would suggest administrative appointments to the court in the name of the governor. He was also in charge of receiving money for favors from the court. Francisco de Borja was accused of violating the rule which did not allow a man to hold multiple appointments. Martín de Escagedo was granted the offices of Captain of the Guard, Factor of the Royal Treasury, Consulate Judge of Appeals, Administrator of the Indian Census, and Royal Butler of the court. Martín's brother was Juan de Escagedo. Martín de Escagedo married María Vega in Lima. She was the sister of Agustín, a Dominican cleric, and Dr. Feliciano de la Vega y Padilla. Their parents were Francisco Vega and Feliciana Padilla y Celis. The viceroy returned to Spain on the death of King Philip III on December 31st, 1621. Martín stayed in Peru for a couple of years in order to settle the remaining business affairs for the viceroy. Afterwards, Escagedo returned to Madrid, where he served Francisco de Borja for many years. Francisco de Borja died in Madrid in 1658. It is important to note that Martín's name had previously been incorrectly documented as Martín de Acedo, due to clerical errors. But on page 139 in the book Corte de Visreyes en el Entrono del Poder en el Perú by Edward Torres Arancibia, he provides us with the correction. There's a letter from 1645 in Madrid from Francisco de Borja to Friar Buenaventura de Salinas y Córdoba. The document thanks Friar Buenaventura for his services, and it is through this letter signed by Martín as Martín de Escagedo, through the mandate of the Prince, Francisco de Borja, that the correct name reveals itself. Circa 1620, Juan de Escagedo Rucabado was a hidalgo from Renedo, Cantabria. He established himself in the town of Yecla in Murcia. He was more than likely a secundón, meaning that he was not the firstborn son among his siblings, and as such would not inherit the family fortune. Secundones would see themselves forced to seek their own wealth in other lands. These hidalgos saw the pueblos to the south as promising. Juan married Úrsula Muso Muñoz, who was the widow of Juan Bernal y Osa, a high-ranking official. Through the advantage of nobility, Juan would become the mayor of Yecla, although under great opposition from the power factions of the area. In 1624, Juan became the administrator of ports and customs in the town of Yecla. Juan sent a letter to the king requesting that he grant him perpetual rights to his office while simultaneously continuing as mayor. Various positions of this nature were being sought by other official holders at the time. There were power struggles among the different bands of oligarchs in Yecla. One such group was Juan de Escagedo as mayor, allied with the councilmen Pedro Muñoz Andrés, Antón Ortega, José Pérez, Francisco Martínez de la Torre, and others. The other faction was the Yarza Amaya family. In 1638, Councilman Pedro Muñoz Andrés was murdered, and Francisco de Yarza was suspected. On May 21st, 1639, 3 men were murdered in the fields: Juan Sanz, Pascual Garcia López, and Sebastián Soriano. They were killed through paid assassins by the Yarza Amaya faction. As mayor, Juan ordered the capture of the criminals so they could be tried. The proceedings were held for Juan Soriano de Amaya, Francisco de Yarza, Pedro Pérez de Amaya, Bartolomé Sánchez de Amaya, and José Vicente Bernal. Councilman Antón Ortega was also murdered that year, and the violence continued for decades. In 1669, we find Francisco Escagedo Muso Muñoz. Francisco was likely the son of Juan de Escagedo Rucabado and Úrsula Muso Muñoz. In 1669, he was a commissioner for the city council of Caravaca. There's a contract in that year signed by Juan de Pareja Marín and Francisco as commissioners, and it's for the construction of the Santa Cruz Temple to continue. Years later, in 1674, we find Francisco Escagedo Muso Muñoz in the position of mayor in Yecla. In 1640, at Musco, Palencia, there was a Gregoria de Escagedo, who was the mother of Manuel Cortés. She is recorded in a 7-page litigation document held at the Valladolid Chancery Archives in Spain. Francisco Salmón Pérez was born February 9, 1640, in Herrera de Camargo, Santander, Cantabria, Spain. His parents were Juan Salmón and María Pérez. Francisco married Catalina de Escagedo Castejón. Her parents were Juan de Escagedo and Catalina de Castejón. Her brother was Juan de Escagedo Castejón. Francisco Salmón Pérez and Catalina's children were Antonio, Francisca, Juan, and Micaela Salmón Escagedo. Juan Salmón Escagedo married Celedonia de Alvear, and they had Eugenia, Federico, Ignacio, Emeterio, and Inés Salmón de Alvear. Their son Federico married Carmina de Aya. They had a son called Juan José Salmón de Aya, Juan Jose married Josefa de Luna, and this line would end up in Lima, Peru, where many descendants exist to this present day. Both my cousin Milagros and I have taken a DNA test, and we are connected to those current-day descendants in Peru. Thankfully, genetics have allowed us to discover that our ancestors are rooted with Juan de Escagedo, married to Catalina de Castellón, and Juan Salmon, married to Maria Perez. Since we don't have the documentation on exactly how they connect on our tree, we can only wonder about it. But for now, we do have the DNA, surnames, and locations in common. Ines, the daughter of Juan Salmon Escagedo and Celedonia de Alvear, married Nicolás Pontejos Barabay. Their grandchild, Antonio Pontejos Cajiga, would be the first Marqués of the House of Pontejos, titled to him by Philip V of Spain, April 29, 1728. Micaela Salmon Escagedo, born in 1664 in Herrera de Camargo, daughter of Francisco and Catalina, married Clemente de la Cotera de la Riva, born in 1639 in Gajano. Their children were Francisca, Juan, Maria, Manuel, and Francisco de la Cotera Salmon. Francisco was born October 4th, 1697 in Gajano, and married Ana Maria, Marquesa de la Riva Cacho, in Mexico. Their descendants would carry on the noble title of their house, Rivas Cacho. Santander, March 1662. Juan de Escagedo was paid in escudos, gold coins, by Pedro Pontejos Salmon for his services as payer in dealing with promissory notes for the operation of the frigate called El Buen Retiro. The frigate was captained by Bernardo Galvan, who sailed it from Flanders to the ports of Santander. Juan de Escagedo, as commissar, acting as payer, had traveled 5 days from this town, Santander, to that of San Vicente de la Barquera, with orders to collect money. He was reimbursed for the journey, along with expenses such as bags that he had bought. On March 20th, 1662, Juan was paid 290 reales, and on March 28th he was paid 130 reales de vellón. Juan de Escagedo and Pedro Pontejos Salmon were likely cousins, sharing ancestry through Francisco Salmon Perez, married to Catalina de Escagedo de Castellón, who were Pedro's great-grandparents. But we are unable to confirm Juan de Escagedo's parents. Pedro Pontejos Salmon was a knight of Calatrava, payer of Las Cuatro Villas, the 4 cities of His Royal Majesty, Attorney General, Perpetual Counselor, and Mayor of Santander. He was married to Margarita de la Cajiga Calva, who was born in Revilla de Camargo. They had 4 children, Maria, Pedro, Francisco, and Antonio Pontejos y de la Cajiga. Antonio, the youngest of his siblings, was born in 1676 and was baptized June 24th. He was the first Marqués of Casa Pontejos, Knight of Santiago, Gentleman and Chamberlain of His Royal Majesty. Founded in 1587, the Order of Religious Barefoots of Nuestra Señora del Carmen Convent in Caravaca was a religious order that adopted a life of poverty. Registered in their book, we read, on July 18, 1664, Ana Jimenez, wife of Don Martín Escagedo, was buried in number 9 on the second stretch of wall. December 4, 1677, Friar Pedro de Jesús María Escagedo, of Nuestra Señora de la Merced, barefoot, was the brother of Francisco Escagedo, had a happy death because he was a servant of God. Buried in grave number 8. In August 1658, there was an uprising in Yecla, and the town council of Vienna received command from the magistrate Don Baltasar Nieto to prepare 100 men to put them down. Those 100 men were not enough. In the end, there was 150, and then the movement was suppressed. Almost 10 years later, in March of 1668, the Council of Vienna received a message from Mr. Andrés de Melgoza, the new magistrate, reporting serious disturbances that were reoccurring in the town of Yecla. There were 4 deaths, and the justice of the town was forced to take refuge in its town hall. The magistrate ordered the city of Vienna to come to his aid with 50 armed men. These violent uprisings were produced by the precarious state of agriculture and by the burden of taxes, which were the ruin of Castilian towns and villages. On May 3rd, 1669, the riot was completely quelled, and the Vienna Council received news that Don José Martín de Badarán had arrived in the town of Yecla. He was the judge commissioned by the king to conduct proceedings and dictate sentences for the events that had occurred in the town. On July 30th of the same year, the judge pronounced sentences against a large group of people. There were also other groups which had intervened with violence in Montealegre and elsewhere, with several deaths as a result. In Yecla on August 3rd, 1669, of which I certify, Jerónimo de Herrera, in the lawsuit and criminal case pending before me by His Majesty's Commission, Francisco Martín de la Torre, Don José Quiles, Don Juan Bernal Soriano, and Pedro de Escagedo Santa, and Martín Escagedo, that I must condemn them, and that where they are found are brought to the public jail of this town, and from it they are taken by a pack beast with a rope around their neck, and with a voice of the town crier in front of them, reciting their crimes, and in this way they are to be taken to the public square of this village, where they are to be hanged on a gallows that is to be placed for this purpose until they naturally die. And thus executed, the heads from the shoulders are to be cut off and divided, and each one is to be placed on a pole and spike in each of the 4 main exits of this town, so that it serves them as punishment and an execution for the crimes they committed, and for others as an example, and that no person dares to remove said heads from where they are placed without a license from justice, the penalty of which is life and loss of their property. And likewise I condemn the aforementioned in forfeiture of all their property, which I apply entirely to the chamber of His Majesty. In 1670 Caravaca, we find Francisco Escagedo Muso involved in an event that occurred there with a nobleman wanting to hold the cross of Caravaca. This Francisco is likely the son of Juan de Escagedo Rucabado and Ursula Muso Muñoz, as the dates, locations, and names are similar. Don Gaspar de Haro y Guzmán, nephew of the Prime Minister and Count Duke of Olivares, had requested to hold the Holy Cross of Caravaca in order to worship. The cross of Caravaca contains a fragment of the true cross of the crucifixion. The story goes as follows. In 1231, in the southeastern Spanish town of Caravaca, a missionary priest named Don Ginés Pérez Chirinos de Cuenca was captured and taken before the Muslim prince. The prince was curious about various Christian practices. He asked the priest to perform Mass so he could witness the ceremony. He allowed the priest to gather all the necessary articles, but when the priest was about to perform Mass, he explained that the cross was missing, and it was needed for the ceremony to proceed. The prince then exclaimed, "Is that not a cross?" The room was then flooded with light, and 2 angels appeared holding the cross of Caravaca. Later it was verified that it was the same cross made with the wood of the cross of Christ that had belonged to the Patriarch Robert of Jerusalem, who was the first bishop of Jerusalem after the conquest of the city during the First Crusades back in 1099 A.D. Now in 1670, the mayor of the town quickly called a meeting of the elected officials, informing them that this nobleman wished to worship the cross, and that he intended to hold it in his hands. During the meeting, Francisco Escagedo Muso stood and took the floor, saying, the wood of the cross had been noticeably damaged in previous occasions that they had unveiled it, and the request should not be granted to any person. Likewise, other officials stood in opposition. The mayor was not pleased with their refusal, saying that on other occasions they had allowed noblemen to hold the relic, and he would not want to offend Don Gaspar de Haro y Guzmán. There was a group among the officials headed by Ignacio de Ortega who were in favor of removing the cross, arguing that it was for a prince of Spain, but the majority of them were against its removal. The ultimate decision was in the hands of the mayor's substitute, Antonio de Robles, since the actual mayor, Francisco Calderón, was sick at home in bed. The decision was finally made to grant the prince access to the cross. The cross was under lock and required 3 keys to remove it. 1 key was held by the town's officials, another by the head of the clergy, and a third by the commander of the castle, Francisco Diaz Martinez de Robles, who refused to hand his key over. Francisco closed off the castle doors, and as soon as the mayor got word, he ordered Francisco jailed. Francisco did not concede, stating that his justification was that the majority of the council was in opposition of removing the relic. The mayor, who was sick, was forced to leave his bed and traveled to the jail, where he found that the commander of the castle was not properly detained or shackled, and that the doors to the jail cell were open. Since Francisco continued to deny them the key, the mayor ordered him restrained until he gave it up. The news of what had occurred reached the Marquess. They decided to release Francisco, believing he could be reasoned with. When Francisco continued to refuse, he was threatened with death, and finally he relinquished the key. Gaspar de Haro y Guzman was then able to hold a cross, and when the ceremony had concluded, he made an offering of 100 ducats. In 1692, there was a Teresa Rosa Velarde Quijano. She was born November 16, 1692. In November of 1737, she was widowed by Antonio de Escagedo. Juan Antonio Pérez Velarde was born in 1702 in Muriedas, Cantabria, Spain. His parents were Francisco Escagedo and María Velarde. He married Juana de Velarde y Cosio. They traveled to the West Indies to colonial New Mexico. About 1736 or earlier, his wife Juana de Velarde y Cosio passed away. In these record transcript entries from the mission of Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe del Paso, we read that by December of 1736, Juan Antonio Pérez Velarde of Muriedas is a widower, and remarried to María Jacinta Valencia, who was also a widow of Andrés Ruiz. In a second entry from December of 1736, we read that Juan Antonio had 2 Apache at his service. In the latter years of his life, Juan Antonio was appointed High Sheriff of the Holy Office of the Inquisition at the mission, which is the location of present-day Juarez, Mexico. The Heraldry's Institute of Rome has an entry for the Escagedo name. It appears during the events of Barcelona and Berga on September 11th and 12th in 1714. The battle was between the Spanish Habsburgs and the French Bourbons, both claiming the Spanish throne when Charles II, the last Spanish Habsburg, died childless in 1700. On this same page we also read that the surname was among the troops of King James II during the reconquest of Alicante, Elche, and Murcia at the end of the 13th century. On June 22, 1725, at the Santa Maria Parish in Renedo de Piélagos, Francisco Antonio Escagedo Reollo married Teresa del Mazo Soribio. His parents were Francisco Escagedo and Josefa de Reollo. Teresa's parents were Roque del Mazo Ceballos and Josefa del Soribio. In Jalapa, Veracruz, Mexico, from 1730 through 1748, there was an Antonio de Escagedo. On April 26, 1730, Escagedo appears in the will of José Antonio de Acosta Ochoa as one of the executors and holders of his assets. In 1738, Domingo Garcia, a resident of the town of Jalapa, granted general powers to Don José Antonio de Acosta, together with Don Antonio de Escagedo, residents of the town, to represent him in all his lawsuits, civil and criminal cases. In 1741, Escagedo granted general powers to Antonio Diaz de Acosta to collect and receive all amounts of silver, gold, and other merchandise from all the people who owed him. In 1742, Juan de Quiros, master blacksmith in the town of Jalapa, and married to Petrona de Jimenez, granted her powers, and Antonio de Escagedo was a witness. And in July 22, 1748, we read, Don Antonio de Escagedo grants special powers to Don Carlos José de Montes, a neighbor of this town of Jalapa, so that in his name he may collect from Don Francisco de Ochoa, a neighbor of this town, the amount of 313 Mexican pesos, Aldonza de Vargas the amount of 106 pesos, and to Don Diego de Castro the amount of 216 pesos and 5 reales, which Don Jose Antonio de Acosta was obligated to pay, either by judicial or extrajudicial means. There is another entry I found from Jalapa 24 years after Antonio's last entry in 1748. In August 26, 1772, Maria Manuela Escagedo, the wife of Juan Jose Velasco, sells to Don Jose Sojo, from this same neighborhood, a lime-muddy wooden house that faces the street that goes down from the public square to the tannery for 300 pesos. 1752, Zarzalamayor Cáceres, Extremadura, Spain. There was a Dr. Bernardo Escagedo Gomez. There's a document referring to services he rendered for tending to the sick of that town for 3 years. 1759, Veta Grande, Zacatecas, Mexico, there was a Lieutenant Pedro Escagedo Canal. And in the book Spaniards, Apaches, and Comanches by Mariano Alonso Baquer, from the chapter called The Campaigns of Cordero and Amparán, circa 1795, there was a Lieutenant Escagedo involved during this period of battle with the Apache across New Mexico and the Rio Grande. In 1765, there was a Friar Juan Escagedo de la Riva. He was the son of Francisco Escagedo de la Riva and Silvestra González. They lived in Madrid, and Juan was baptized in the Santo Justos y Pastor parish, Diocese of Toledo. In the town of Ucieda in Rente, Cantabria, Spain, there is a casona known as Palacio de Escagedo. Along a window there is a cross with the date 1772 on it. This is also one of the towns and areas where the Mier y Terán family lines were from, where Juan de Mier y Terán, 1658 to 1718, was married to Maria Magdalena Sánchez de Escagedo, and whose descendants would figure prominently in the Americas, but we do not know who lived in this building, and we can only wonder. In Soto de la Marina, 1799, Francisco de Escagedo Gavia from Maliaño married Teresa del Risotto Tesio. Francisco's parents were Juan de Escagedo Salcines and Antonia de Gavia. His siblings were Ignacia and María de Escagedo Gavia. Teresa's parents were Domingo del Risotto de Herrera and Manuela de Tesio y Garcia. Teresa's brother, Antonio, married María de Escagedo Gavia, who died young. March 30th, 1800, in Renedo de Piélagos, Francisco Escagedo del Mazo passed away at about the age of 70, more or less, as they wrote. He created his will before the notary Antonio de la Pedraja. It reads that he had no surviving heirs and that his wife was Josefa Santelices, who had been buried by the same parish priest in Renedo. But we have other records for Francisco, his wife Josefa, and their children born from 1771 through 1778. Their children were Teresa Maria, born in 1771, Domingo Ramón, 1773, Adrián Ramón in 1775, Fernando Antonio Marcos in 1778, and Jeromina Antonia Escagedo Santelices in 1778. The parents of Josefa were Juan de Santelices and Josefa Fernández Ceballos. Francisco Escagedo del Mazo's death certificate also reads that his nephew, Francisco de la Riva, was his heir. Francisco Escagedo del Mazo's parents were Francisco Antonio Escagedo Reollo and Teresa del Mazo Soribio. His paternal grandparents were Francisco Escagedo and Josefa de Reollo. His maternal grandparents were Roque del Mazo Ceballos and Josefa del Soribio. Also found in the parish records of Renedo are the children of Francisco de la Riva Escagedo, the heir to Francisco Escagedo del Mazo. Francisco de la Riva Escagedo was married to Teresa Fernandez Acereda. Francisco was the son of Juan de la Riva Escagedo and Maria Escagedo, likely Escagedo del Mazo. Teresa's parents were Martín Fernández de la Gándara and María de Acereda. Francisco de la Riva Escagedo and Teresa Fernández Acereda had 6 children who were recorded in this parish. Ángela in 1804, Manuela Simona 1806, Carmila 1808, Juana 1810, Juan 1813, and Nemesio Francisco Antonio Escagedo Acereda in 1818. There's also a section of confirmation records at this parish from 1821. In it we find the names of Manuela, Juana, Antonio, and Agustín, children of Francisco Escagedo and Teresa Acereda. Could this Agustín be my third great-grandfather? If so, it would unlock previous generations, but we remain uncertain. The next time Agustín Escagedo appears is in Quijano, with his wife Josefa Antonia Mier, attending the marriage of their son, Pedro Escagedo Mier, married to Josefa Martínez Otero, on January 19, 1849. In 1801, Antonio de Escagedo Cajigas, from Maliaño, born in 1779, married Joaquina Juárez. Antonio's parents were Vicente Escagedo and María Cajigas. They had been deceased at the time of the marriage. Joaquina's parents were Isidoro Juárez and Manuela Gomez. Around this time there was also a Micaela Escagedo, possibly Antonio's sister, and she was married to Manuel de la Cajigas Cavia. On January 24, 1809, in the Extraordinary Gazette of Mexico, there was an Ignacio Escagedo that contributed donations that were being collected. In 1846, there was a Julián de Escagedo, a soldier during the Mexican-American War, fighting for the United States under the mounted volunteers of Captain Sandoval in territorial New Mexico. This old document is my grandfather's birth certificate. It's the certified copy made in Maliaño, July 21st, 1930, as my grandfather was immigrating to Cuba. Maliaño is a hamlet in the north of Spain in Cantabria. Along with other hamlets in the area, this is where my family, the paternal side, all are known and documented Escagedos, come from. Maliaño sits elevated just south of Santander and by the water that leads out to the Bay of Biscay. Throughout the centuries, many ships have traveled from here to other parts of Europe and later to the New World in the 1500s. Our family ties to this hamlet run deep. In my research, I came across this census document dated October 6, 1752. It's a sworn account given to the king by the residents of Maliaño. In it we read the names of José Calderón, Juan del Regato, Ignacio de las Cajigas, Francisco de las Cajigas, Francisco de la Sierra Salmón, and Pedro Escagedo. The town had 28 residents then, 10 widows, 36 habitable houses, and due to all the residents being nobles, they did not pay ordinary or extraordinary taxes. On my grandfather's birth certificate, we read, December 1911, Don Felix Escagedo Salmón, a native of Maliaño, came to the municipality of Camargo, Santander Province, 26 years old, married, a laborer, and a neighbor of this village, requesting the inscription in the aforementioned civil registry of a child as the father of the same. He declared that said child was born at home on the 29th day of the current year at 10 in the morning. Years ago, when my dad was still living, he produced a tiny photo of my great-grandfather Felix Escagedo Salmón. He explained that my grandfather carried it in his wallet all his life, and it was the only photo he had of his father. Since then, I have been able to clean up the photo significantly. Thanks to my cousin Elena Escagedo Cotera, I now have a second photo of Felix. It's from the wedding of Indalecio Escagedo Gomez and Rosa Campo. On my grandfather's birth certificate, we have his ancestors recorded. Parents, Felix Escagedo Salmon of Maliaño and Eloisa Valle Fernandez from Revilla. Paternal grandparents, Millán Escagedo Mier of Bo de Mortera and Balbina Salmon Escagedo of Maliaño. Maternal grandparents, Santiago Valle from Campo Ayuntamiento and Ventura Fernandez from Molledo. Felix and Eloise also had a daughter, Balbina Escagedo Valle, who was born in 1913. Apart from many hours of reconstructing family history with Milagros, one day my cousin paid a visit to the civil registries in Maliaño. She was able to obtain dozens of family records, including my great-grandfather's birth certificate. His full name was Patricio Felix Escagedo Salmon. In 1941, there was a great fire that destroyed buildings and archives across the area. People at the time were asked to return to the civil registries in order to reconstruct the missing documents. Many living at the time did so, while some may have not and are therefore missing. Many of those which had been deceased prior to the fires were no longer accounted for, as well as those that had left the country through migration. That was the case with my grandfather, but luckily we have his 1930 birth certificate copy and passport, which he took with him, and are in my care. With the reconstructed civil birth certificates, it has been possible to acquire the names of children's parents and great-grandparents. And then there are the existing church records for many of the same people, although many of those records had also been destroyed due to fires and war. A few months back, Milagros also visited the cemetery of Maliaño to confirm if Felix rests in the Escagedo Salmon mausoleum. In previous photos, a certain plaque was covered by flowers in every picture taken. I suspected it was my great-grandfather's plaque, and her visit confirmed it once and for all.
Aquí tienes a tu bisabuelo.
The cemetery is just across from the airport.
Ese es el aeropuerto para allá. Hay el aeropuerto y aquí el cementerio.
There is an ancient Roman bath structure that was uncovered there, and excavations have been taking place.
Aquí todo esto que vemos aquí, que te dije que es antiguo, esto es el cementerio. Todo esto son unas termas romanas. Le estoy enseñando porque estos son restos de termas romanas.
The Escagedo Salmon Pantheon is further down towards the back of the cemetery on the left.
A ver si se ve bien el nombre, Escagedo Salmon. ¿Tienes las llaves?
As we suspected, Felix's plaque is right below his brother Mateo. Also resting there is Benita Escagedo Salmon, Valentina Escagedo Gomez, Balbina Escagedo Gomez, José López Taucia, Pedro Escagedo Salmon, Manuela Gómez Santa María, Serapia Escagedo Gomez, Fernando Sierra Hernández, Manuel Escagedo Gomez, Eugenia Calleja Miranda, and Balbina Escagedo Valle. My grandfather and his sister Balbina grew up in the care of his aunt Benita Escagedo Salmon and her brother Mateo Escagedo Salmon. Their mother Eloisa passed away when Eloy and Balbina were young. Their aunt Benita took care of many kids throughout her life, such as Benita's younger brother Gregorio, who would immigrate to Cuba at an early age. Benita never married and always lived with Mateo. Mateo's work, his numerous books, are used to this day for genealogy research. My grandfather would travel with him as he uncovered old manuscripts held in public and private collections that were scattered all across the towns and villages of Cantabria. With encouragement from Mateo, Eloy at an early age began his studies for the priesthood at Monte Corban. But Eloy soon had a change of heart, and the decision was made to send him to Cuba, where his uncle Gregorio Escagedo Salmon lived. Gregorio's mother, Balbina Salmon Escagedo, died giving birth to him, and his father, Diego Millán Escagedo Mier, passed away a few years after. Gregorio, under the care of his aunt and uncle, had also studied for the priesthood before my grandfather's time. But it was not his calling either, and he immigrated to Cuba at the age of 15, where his older brother Fernando was living. Fernando Escagedo Salmon left for Cuba on November 20th, 1906. Fernando was a correspondent for El Diario de la Marina newspaper in Cruces, Cuba. At the age of 18, my grandfather set out for Havana, Cuba, from the port of Santander on the steamship Cristobal Colón, Thursday, September 11th, 1930. In Aguada, Eloy lived his life like any other young man of the time. He met a beautiful Cuban lady by the name of Ramona Facunda Lliraldi Alvarez, and they married on March 21st, 1941. Ramona was born in Aguada de Pasajeros, July 3rd, 1911. She was the daughter of Felix Lliraldi Hernández and Romualda Álvarez González. The Lliraldis were descendants of Italian immigrants that had immigrated to the island in the mid to late 1800s. The name Lliraldi had been altered from its original spelling along the way, and in my research I have discovered that the name was originally Lliraldi, and that they originated in Armento Potenza, Basilicata. Felix Lliraldi's father, Domingo, or Domenico, was remembered as not being understood well when speaking his Italian in the Spanish-speaking country. Domingo married Facunda Hernández, and they had 4 children: Benito, Juan, Isolina, and my great-grandfather, Felix Lliraldi Hernández. Benito at some point discovered a buried chest on his farm which was filled with Spanish gold coins. It appears that the Lliraldi siblings shared in the bounty, as many of their descendants have their own stories about the gold. Some of those gold coins were made into jewelry and remained with some of the family members for years. The 4 Lliraldi siblings would go into business together in the early 1900s, bringing electricity to Aguada for the first time. The electrical plant was approved June 14, 1913, and Benito Lliraldi is mentioned in the official Gazette, which mentions the conditions to be met for its construction. In the beginning, they offered the service for free and for certain hours of the day. This way, people would become accustomed to the new system, as they were suspicious of electricity and its effects. Eventually, the Lliraldis would be forced to sell their business when an American company threatened to price them out. Decades after, there was still a local saying that people use for all manner of daily situations, till Lliraldi turns on the lights. Romualda Álvarez González was born February 7, 1887, in Abreu Cienfuegos, Cuba. Her siblings were María Margarita, Andrés, Santiago, Saturina, and Cristino Álvarez González. Romualda and Felix Lliraldi Hernández had 4 children: Luis, my grandmother Ramona, Evangelina Cuca, who married Gabriel Tapanes Rodríguez, and Ramón Lliraldi Álvarez. They lived on a farm in an area called Cocodrilo, close to Aguada de Pasajeros. Romualda was widowed by Felix early on, and during the Great Depression lost all her savings. It would be her youngest child, Ramón, who would take charge of the family finances and lead them out of the crisis. He found an attorney, sued the bank, and they were able to save the farm. On November 14, 1942, Eloy and Ramona had their first and only child, my father, Eloy Escagedo Lliraldi. Eloy grew up as any child of his day, playing and going to school and having many friends. In the early part of the 1950s, Eloy and Ramona bought a store in Aguada and named it La Francia. The business sold clothes, shoes, textiles, jewelry of lesser value, and toys. For the toys, Eloy had the foresight of stocking the place with higher-end items such as electric train sets and fancy dolls. This made it so that La Francia was the store that sold the most toys along El Circuito Sur Highway from Colón to Cienfuegos. Millán Escagedo Garcia, son of Gregorio Escagedo Salmon, opened a line of credit for his employees at La Francia. so that their wives and children could visit the shop for gifts. And Maria Garcia Mazas, the wife of Gregorio Escagedo Salmon, would send Eloy $100 to fill boxes of toys for the priest to hand out to kids. Other farm and ranch owners like Claudio Sasso Lliraldi Hernandez and the Valle family opened lines of credit there as well. All of this happened during Christmas in Aguada de Pasajeros. Back in Maliaño on August 13, 1949, Eloy's father, Patricio Feli Escagedo Salmon, passed away at the age of 64. He had hearing problems, and as he was working the fields owned by Jose Barros, a tram car struck him. Patricio Félix was buried in the Escagedo Salmon Pantheon in the Maliaño Cemetery. In 1963, on St. Barbara's Day, the communist militia arrived to confiscate Eloy and Ramona's store. And likewise, many other businesses were taken from their rightful owners that day. In Eloy's case, he didn't have employees, and Ramona was the only one who helped him run the store. The militia told him not to touch anything or open the safe, in which, apart from cash, he stored his documents. Eloy was never an activist, but he always voted during each election, as he had become a Cuban citizen. After the store was taken from him, he was sent to a work assignment office. The communists of the town who knew Eloy were well aware that he was not a field worker, so they sent him to work in the fields. Ramona was sent to work as an employee at another store, which they had also taken from its original owners. My second great-grandfather, Diego Millán Escagedo Mier, was born in Bo de Mortera about the mid-1800s. We have him documented through his children's birth certificates, as with his grandchildren's, like my grandfather. We also have his listings of land sales found in the official Bulletin of Santander throughout the 1800s. He was the son of Agustín Escagedo and Antonia Josefa Mier. The Escagedo Mier siblings were 7 that we know of: Pedro, Vicente, Benita, Moisés, José, Joaquín, and Millán. For Vicente Eugenio Escagedo, we only have one document from September 25, 1845. Vicente was from Bo, and as with many of the Escagedo Mier siblings, he also traveled to Cuba. We're still trying to discover more. These were the Escagedo Mier siblings. Pedro Escagedo Mier married Josefa Martínez Otero on January 19, 1849, in Quijano, Cantabria, Spain. The marriage certificate names Agustín Escagedo and Josefa Mier as Pedro's parents, and Tomás Martínez Villegas and María Fernández Otero as the parents of Josefa. Pedro and Josefa had 6 children that we know of: Telesfora, who died April 11, 1906, in Quijano; Carolina in 1851, who died in that same year; Juan Manuel, born in June of 1852; Josefa, born in 1854, who married Santiago Castillo; Venancia in 1857, who married Mateo Oruña Olaís; and Eusebio José Telesforo Escagedo Martínez, of whom I have not been able to properly document as of yet. Benita Escagedo Mier. Benita married Juan Salmon. They had 5 children: Balbina, who married Diego Millán Escagedo Mier; Pedro Salmón Escagedo married Sara Fernández Villegas. They had 8 children: Antonio, who married Rosa Bustillo Revuelta; Carlos Norberto, Emiliana, Fernando, Julián Fermín, María del Pino Ramona, Orina, and Jesus Restituto Salmón Fernández. Restituto left for Cuba on January 19, 1923. There's a later entry from November 1st, 1926 as well, where he travels from Santander to Cuba on the Cristóbal Colón. In December of 1930, in Aguada de Pasajeros, Cuba, Restituto married Carmen Garcia Mazas, and they had 2 children. Carmen was the daughter of Benito Garcia Hermida and Manuela Mazas. Her siblings were Francisco Paco, who was married to Rosa Ramos Alvarez, and Maria Dolores Garcia Mazas, who was married to Gregorio Escagedo Salmon. Restituto owned a clothing and shoe store called El Águila on Calle Martí, Calle Real, in Aguada de Pasajeros. He passed away in Miami, Florida, July 18, 1978. Carmen passed away September 23, 2000. Provinciana, who married Dionisio Torre Barcena. They had 9 children: Dionisio, Emilia, Emilio, Francisco, Pedro, Maria Prudenciana, who married Ángel Solano, and Carmen Torres Salmon, born in 1893, who would marry Gonzalo Aja, and had 8 children during their marriage. Carmen and Gonzalo immigrated to Vermont in the U.S., where her husband Gonzalo Aja died in 1940. Carmen remarried with Raymond Fernandez, who was from Santander. Carmen died in Vermont on February 6, 1968. Venancia Salmon Escagedo married Pedro Rivas Gomez and had 8 children: Amelia, Aurelia, who married Pedro Salcines Salmon, Francisco, who married Teresa Cajigas, Jacinta, Patrocinio, José, Cándida, who married Miguel Gutiérrez Fernández, and Juan Rivas Salmon, who married Lucia Blanco Aya. Cándida Salmon Escagedo married Álvaro Rivas Gomez, and they had 3 children: Esperanza, who married Ramón Canal Gómez, Toribio, who married Ventura Bengochea Cruz, and Mateo Rivas Salmon. Moisés Escagedo Mier was born in 1831. He immigrated to Cuba at the age of 15, where he owned a clothing store business. He is also documented in the official Bulletin of Santander, his name appearing next to his brothers throughout the years. José Escagedo Mier, born about 1836, he married twice, having children from each marriage. There was the children from his marriage to an unknown Salmon, Isidoro, who died in Cuba in 1885, his daughter Rosa, who married Andrés Cacho Cajigas, and Agustín Escagedo Salmon, born in 1843, who died single at the age of 32 on December 10, 1875. José Escagedo Mier's children from the marriage to an unknown Cacho were Filomena, who married Damaso Sierra Valle, and they had 3 children, Rufina, Luisa, and Eladia Sierra Escagedo. She lived from 1858 to December 5, 1938. Next, there was Severiano Escagedo Cacho, born in 1862. He lived and worked in Cárdenas, Cuba, close to Varadero. We don't know when he first traveled there. It's possible that it would have been at an early age, but we're not certain. On May 11, 1891, police became aware of a house on Velázquez Street that was producing money. They entered and found Severiano, who was the main tenant, occupying a room of the house with tools for falsifying coins. They later arrested Genaro Sanchez, who was also a tenant and accomplice, upon returning home. The authorities also found Ulpiano Lasso with false coins of gold and silver, with the intentions in spending them. On December 6, 1894, Severiano was sentenced to 10 years and 1 day in prison. 13 years later, in 1907, we find Severiano as owner of a business called Sociedad Mercantil Regular Colectiva de Escagedo y Sala. He was in the business of industrial saddlery products. In 1907, his co-owner, Salvador Sala, had passed away. In 1923, Severiano was living in Havana, and we have an address of Castillo 21. There's a document created July and stamped on the 23rd of November 1923 with a patent registered to Severiano. The patent was for leg gaiters. Severiano Escagedo Cacho died in 1937 by suicide, hanging himself at Dolores 333 in Havana, Cuba. He left a note for the court and his family. He wrote that he had made this decision because he was sick and tired of life. Patricio Escagedo Cacho, born in 1864, till his death on May 20th, 1936, at the age of 72. Patricio married an unknown Sierra, and they had 3 children: Concepcion, who married Ramiro Cajigas, Francisca, who married Victoriano Rodriguez, and Luisa Escagedo Cacho, born in 1896 till May 27, 1982. Luisa married Segundo Cajigas. Jose Escagedo Mier is also the direct ancestor of Jose Cavia Soto. He lives right there where all our ancestors were from. He has been researching the family tree extensively and photographing all the cemeteries throughout Santander, many of which are used in this documentary. Our most recent known connection would be through Agustín Escagedo and Josefa Antonia Mier. And then there was Joaquín Escagedo Mier, who appears in multiple documents as well as land listings. Much of the land in Maliaño and what is now the airport was owned by various Escagedos and other common surnames with long-standing ties to the hamlet. In the 1800s, it also appears that Cuba, being a colony of Spain, was traveled a lot by the Escagedo family, and a number of them operated various businesses there. I have a few working Escagedo trees that currently have key people missing from each that, if found, would likely unite all those trees into one. On one of those trees I have Bonifacio Joaquín Escagedo. I believe this is the same person as Joaquín Escagedo Mier. If so, then Bonifacio Joaquín Escagedo Mier would be the same person who was born in 1838 in Bo de Piélagos. And he had traveled to Cuba at the age of 16. He married Maria Saro Colza, 1840 to 1917, and had the following children: Hermenegilda, Manuela, Maria, Fernando, and Norberto Escagedo Saro. There is also an Eloy Escagedo Saro, which I believe may be Joaquín and Maria's son, but the dates I have reviewed leave me unsure as to exactly how they fit in the tree. Hermenegilda was a teacher in Maliaño as well as Zamora. She was possibly married to Francisco Sáenz, or Sáenz. Manuela was married to Alonso López. Maria was also a teacher in Maliaño and married Domingo Serna Rivas. Fernando married twice, first with Francisca Agudo Solana, and they had Ricardo. Then Fernando married Lucinda Merodio Posada, and they had the following children: Fernando, who married Isabel Arenal Porras, Maria, who married José Palomera Mier, Carmen, who married José Martínez Mediavilla, and Luis Escagedo Merodio. The other son of Bonifacio Joaquín Escagedo Mier and Maria Saro Colza was Norberto. He married Ana Maria Romana Navedo Perez, and they had Marina Escagedo Navedo, married to César Gómez Aldalur, and Joaquín Escagedo Navedo, married to Lucrecia Serafina Cajiga Crespo. Joaquín and Lucrecia had Francisco Javier, Joaquín, and Lucrecia Escagedo Cajiga. Diego Millán Escagedo Mier, married to Balbina Salmón Escagedo. Millán was the son of Agustín Escagedo and Josefa Antonia Mier. Balbina was the daughter of Juan Salmón and Benita Escagedo Mier. Benita was Millán's sister. Balbina's siblings were Provinciana, Pedro, Venancia, and Cándida Salmón Escagedo. This old clipping tells us about the Escagedo Salmón family in the late 1800s. The paper was written as a memorial about the life and work of Mateo Escagedo Salmón on the centennial of his birth. Millán and Balbina had 7 children: Juan, who died when young from the kick of a mule; Mateo, priest and official chronicler of the province of Santander; Patricio Félix, married to Eloísa Valle Fernández, my great-grandparents; Benita, who cared for her siblings, nieces, and nephews she never married; Vicente Pedro married Manuela Gómez Santamaría, who were the great-grandparents to my cousin Milagros Escagedo Blanco; Fernando, who died in Cuba; and Gregorio Julián Escagedo Salmón, who married María Dolores Garcia Mazas. The Escagedo Salmón family lived in this house, which is a typical Montañés Highlander construction style for the area, called a casona. It's located in Maliaño, and today it sits in ruin. The street at the intersection is named after Mateo Escagedo Salmon. At one point there were talks to make it a museum, since Mateo was a notable figure in the history of Cantabria, but those plans never materialized. The Escagedo Salmon siblings that had descendants were Felix Escagedo Salmon, who married Eloisa Valle Fernandez. They had Antonia Escagedo Valle, though not much is known of her currently, my grandfather Eloy, and Balbina Escagedo Valle. Next there was Vicente Pedro Escagedo Salmon, who married Manuela Gomez Santamaria, and they had 12 children. They were Valentina, Balbina, Gregorio, Serapia, Pedro, Indalecio, Cándida, Fernando, Consuelo, Juan, Manuel, and Celestino Escagedo Gomez. And then there was the youngest of the 7, Gregorio Julián Escagedo Salmon, married to María Garcia Mazas. They had Gregorio, Marcos Millán, and Agustín Escagedo Garcia. Vicente Pedro Escagedo Salmon was born on August 29, 1888. He was a government official in Camargo, also owning land and cattle. Pedro married Manuela Gomez Santamaria, who was born on March 28, 1892. At the end of the war, he had to abandon his position and dedicate himself to cultivating and selling the products of his lands. Also, at the end of the Civil War, Pedro was looted by phalangists who took cattle and food on various occasions. They imprisoned their son Gregorio and their son-in-law José Ara for their political ideas, and they humiliated his 2 daughters for the position he held in the town hall during the Republic. Manuela was the daughter of Juan Gómez Tazón and Valentina Santamaria del Río. Manuela Gómez Santamaria was always a happy, caring, and hard-working woman. Manuela would always have a neighbor at her table with her husband and children, sharing their stews. When their neighbors got sick or gave birth, she'd disappear in the late afternoon to bring them a chicken or some food to help. Many times neighbors would come to her house because they had nothing for dinner, and Manuela would help with milk and cornmeal. Others waited for dawn to offer help in the family's daily work, and thus share a table with them. These charitable acts may be the origin of the name given to the family formed by Pedro and Manuela, being called Los Charitas. Her house was always a meeting point for the neighborhood, and those who knew her still remember the smell of coffee, sharing a cup and pleasant conversations. Manuela liked to go to the festivals of the neighboring towns, to dance to Montañés Highlander music, and to enjoy with friends and neighbors. She was loved by all. Pedro and Manuela had 12 children together. Pedro died on April 21, 1950. Manuela died on March 29, 1968. The Escagedo Gomez siblings were Valentina Escagedo Gomez, born on September 22, 1914, was the oldest of 12 siblings. After the Civil War, Valentina and her sister Serapia were victimized by militants due to the fact that their father, Pedro, was a Republican. They were humiliated publicly by having their hair shaved off, something that Valentina never forgot. In 1960, she immigrated to Brazil, where her brother Gregorio was living. Valentina eventually returned to Spain after retiring. She never married and died on January 20th, 1992. Balbina Escagedo Gomez, born on March 28, 1916, was the second daughter of Pedro and Manuela. She lived some years in Santillana del Mar with her uncle Mateo Escagedo Salmon and his sister Benita, along with their cousins Eloy and Balbina Escagedo Valle. Balbina married José López and didn't have any descendants. She lived in Maliaño until she died on February 22, 2003. Gregorio Escagedo Gomez, born April 23, 1917, he fought on the Republican side during the Civil War and was jailed for 3 years. He was hospitalized at the Marqués de Valdecilla Hospital in Santander due to an operation. And that's where he met his future wife, Luisa López Collado, Luisa was a nurse in training at the time. Gregorio and Luisa had one child, Francisco Vicente Escagedo Lopez. In 1955, Gregorio immigrated to Brazil while his family waited for him to establish himself there. After a few months, he began working with high-voltage transformers in Porto Alegre. One day as he was working, another technician turned the power on, and Gregorio received a shock of electricity that sent him flying and striking a wall some distance away. He was in a coma for 3 months, and then another 9 months in the hospital. Gregorio had lost his memory, and after being discharged, he was directed to where he had been living before the accident. He found that he had no belongings left, neither clothes or money. They had thought that the Spaniard would not survive his injuries and took all his things. After this, he traveled to Argentina, Uruguay, and other Latin American countries, until one day he remembered who he was, and of his wife and son, and then returned to Porto Alegre, and wrote to his wife of what had happened. In 1959, the family was reunited in Porto Alegre. Gregorio Escagedo Gomez passed away July 9, 1977. Luisa Lopez Collado passed away in 2020. Serapia Escagedo Gomez, born November 17, 1918, was the fourth child of Vicente Pedro and Manuela. About the age of 15, she lived in Santillana del Mar for around 2 years. She was in the care of her aunt and uncle Benita and Mateo Escagedo Salmon, and also accompanied by Eloy and Balbina Escagedo Valle. Mateo saw the ability in her for higher education and presented the idea to her father. But he declined as they were 12 children, saying, "If we cannot afford it for all the children, we will not afford it for one." After the Civil War, Serapia and her sister were humiliated when the Phalangists shaved their heads off due to their father being a Republican. Serapia married Fernando Sierra Hernandez, and they had 4 children, one of which is Maribel Sierra Escagedo, who has helped us in our research. Serapia's husband Fernando had health problems which prevented him from working long periods, so Serapia sold newspapers, ice cream, and door-to-door coupons from a jewelry store. Often she'd leave her final stop in order to visit with her youngest brother, Tino, and the family. Despite the work, she was always smiling, happy, and raised her children with a lot of love. Serapia passed away December 4th, 1995. Pedro Escagedo Gomez, born February 18, 1920, was the 5th son of Vicente Pedro and Manuela. Pedro married Isabel Palacio Martín, and they had 2 children. The family immigrated to Argentina, where he was a metal worker, later working with leather, making hats and all sorts of military clothing. He would eventually own the business called Escagedo Hermanos. He visited Spain on 2 final occasions before his passing. Indalecio Escagedo Gomez, born August 20th, 1921, was the 6th son of Vicente Pedro and Manuela Gomez. He worked with his father's cattle and land. Later he worked at Nueva Montaña in Quijano until his retirement. Indalecio married Rosa Campo Chavez, and they had 2 sons, José Luis and Juan Antonio Escagedo Campo. Indalecio and Rosa were the grandparents of Mónica and Elena Escagedo Cotera, who helped us on this project. Cándida Escagedo Gomez, born September 19, 1922, was the 7th daughter of Vicente Pedro and Manuela Gomez. She married José Ara Villanueva, and they had 4 children. The family had difficult times as José Ara was jailed because he had fought on the Republican side during the Civil War. Afterwards, in 1960, José and his brother Tomás created the Fundaciones Craig Foundry in Maliaño. Cándida was generous and kind, always lending a helping hand to family and friends. Cándida passed away on August 25, 2013. Fernando Escagedo Gomez, born January 16, 1924, was the 8th son of Vicente Pedro and Manuela. He married Adelaida Cadelo Rios. They had 4 children. They suffered greatly when their second child, Estrella, died at just 18 months of age. He worked at Benito's workshop and later at Nueva Montaña in Quijano. Fernando passed away May 8, 2001. Consuelo Escagedo Gomez, born April 30th, 1926, was the 9th daughter of Vicente Pedro and Manuela. She married Angel Cobo and they had 3 children. Consuelo was outgoing and conversational. She would administer prescribed injections for family and friends that needed them, and she was skilled at it too. For years she would fish for clams to help feed her family. Her husband suffered a stroke when he was still young, and she cared for him till his passing. Consuelo Escagedo Gomez passed around the age of 80. Juan Escagedo Gomez, born June 20th, 1927, was the 10th son of Vicente Pedro and Manuela. He was caring, joyful, and conversational. He was respected and loved by family, friends, and neighbors. Juan married Blanca Cavia, and they had 3 children. He worked at Nueva Montaña in Quiano. In 1962, he left to Brazil for work, but returned soon, as it was not what he had expected. Later, he worked at the Craig Foundry until he retired. He enjoyed singing with friends and family, and he was also a member of the choir in Maliaño. Juan passed away February 15th, 2015. His wife Blanca Cavia passed away March 4th, 2013. Manuel Escagedo Gomez, born January 1st, 1930, was the 11th son of Vicente Pedro and Manuela. He had a joyful, generous, and caring personality. Manuel married Eugenia Calleja Miranda, and they had 5 children. Both were hardworking and generous to their neighbors. Manuel worked as a welder at Báscula Montaña, as well as a cattleman. Manuel passed away July 16th, 2017. Eugenia Calleja passed away August 27, 2015. Celestino Escagedo Gomez, born October 20th, 1933, was the 12th son of Vicente Pedro and Manuela. He was the youngest of the Escagedo Gomez siblings, and lived a humble but happy life. Despite their needs and having less food during the post-war era, they were self-sufficient, but they could not afford to spend on whims. Celestino was a good, hard-working, and honest man. He worked as a rancher and farmer on his father's land. After getting married, he worked at Craig Foundries and Standard Electrical, where copper cables were made for telephone companies. For years, he worked 12 hours on the night shift at Standard Electrical and 4 hours at Craig until his retirement. Cheerful, he was always at the center of get-togethers and excursions with friends. He would tell jokes and sing his songs of Cantabria while drumming his fingers to the music. Celestino married Milagros Blanco Gorrochategui, and they had 3 children. He adored his wife, children, and grandchildren. Celestino Gomez passed away July 13, 2016, at the age of 82. His funeral was accompanied by a crowd of people, where his friends read an emotional letter in his memory. Gregorio Escagedo Salmon was born November 28, 1895, in Maliaño. Around 1910, and at 15 years of age, he immigrated to Cuba. In Aguada de Pasajeros, Gregorio didn't have much, and slept atop the counter of a store. Early on, he began to manifest his entrepreneurial talents. He would sell clothes to locals all around the countryside of Aguada on horseback. As soon as he had earned enough money, Gregorio bought a store on Calle Martí, Calle Real, and named it La Racha. Little by little, he earned and saved, eventually buying a ranch, which he stocked with cattle. In this way, he continued the purchase of lands, adding more cattle, as well as growing rice and sugar. While still at La Racha, Gregorio married Maria Garcia Mazas, and they had 3 children, Gregorio II, Marcos Millán, and Agustín Escagedo Garcia. Gregorio's wife, Maria, was the daughter of Benito Garcia Hermida, a successful businessman, and Manuela Mazas. Maria's siblings were Francisco Paco and Carmen Garcia Mazas. Francisco married Rosa Ramos Alvarez, whose mother was Maria Margarita Alvarez González, sister to my great-grandmother, Romualda. Carmen married Jesus Restituto Salmon Fernández. Restituto was the son of Pedro Salmon Escagedo and Sara Fernández Villegas. As time went on, Gregorio was recognized as one of the top businessmen in Cuba. He bought multiple sugar mills, including Fidencia, Najasa, and Siboney. He partnered with Julio Lobo and the Escagedo family, buying the Perseverancia mill in Aguada, as well as El Pilar and El Central Caracas. Gregorio's son, Gregorio Escagedo Garcia, would fly a plane between properties as he managed the mill. But Gregorio Jr. had crashed the plane in the past. His parents were concerned for their son's safety, and Gregorio sold the Nasaja and Siboney mills so he would not have to fly. With cattle, they dedicated themselves to improving the breed. The Escagedos won many awards for their work, and in La Ciénaga de Zapata, they increased their rice production as well. In 1960, when Castro took control of the island, Gregorio and Maria left for Madrid with their youngest son, Agustín. Their other two sons, Gregorio and Marcos Millán, settled in Miami, Florida. Gregorio and Maria missed their family and friends and eventually relocated to Miami. Gregorio Escagedo Salmon passed away July 26, 1988. His wife, Maria Dolores Garcia Mazas, passed away August 7, 1998. Gregorio Escagedo Garcia was born February 16, 1924. He was the first son of Gregorio and Maria. He graduated as an attorney from the University of Havana. He dedicated himself to his father's businesses as administrator of the Fidencia sugar mill as well as with their cattle business. He married Beatriz Carreras Martinez, and they had 3 children. When Castro took control of Cuba, Gregorio and his family relocated to Miami, Florida. Gregorio and his brother Millán, who also lived in Miami, bought a ranch in South Florida and began to rebuild what they had lost. As time went on, Gregorio, along with other investors, began rebuilding a sugar production business in Haiti and Costa Rica. In Miami, he was very active in the cause against the communist Cuban regime. He founded the organization La Asociación de Hacendados de Cuba en el Exilio, tirelessly fighting for private property rights and a free Cuba. Gregorio Escagedo Garcia passed away October 8, 2000. His wife Beatriz Carreras Martinez passed away December 15, 2015. Marcos Millán Escagedo Garcia was born October 7, 1928, and was the second son of Gregorio and Maria. Millán was the administrator of various ranches such as Las Maravillas. The ranch was on the Circuito Sur highway and displayed the family logo. On this ranch, as with their other ranches, their Cebu cattle grazed the land. Millán married Lucia Suarez Grau, and they had 3 children. The family relocated to Miami, Florida in 1960 when Castro took control of the island. In Miami, the family purchased a ranch along Highway 27 and named it Florida Ranch. Millán was in charge of the ranch, and his brother Gregorio would travel selling their cattle. Through their hard work, Florida Ranch became well known across the United States as well as Central and South America. The Cebu cattle were considered among the best in the world. Some from Aguada de Pasajeros, now living in Miami, also worked on the ranch. As time passed, Millán dedicated his work towards banking and became chairman of the board. Regardless of his businesses, Millán always did his part in working to see Cuba freed of totalitarianism. Marcos Millán Escagedo Garcia passed away September 17, 2013. Agustín Escagedo Garcia was born August 12, 1933, and was the third son of Gregorio and Maria. Agustín always proved to be a great student, and at the end of high school he simultaneously studied law at the University of Havana and accounting at Villanueva University. Upon graduation, Agustín moved to the United States and studied for a master's degree in business at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Business. On his return to Cuba, he met a beautiful young girl from Havana, Maria Elena Suarez Bustamante, and they married. In 1960, at the triumph of Castro's revolution, he left for Madrid, where he established his residence with his family. They had 3 children. In Cuba, Agustín had worked with Julio Lobo, and the partnership continued in Spain for 2 more years. In early 1962, Agustín formed a grain brokerage society with a friend. It was called Sonaco. Years later, he expanded his business vision and partnered with an American company, A.E. Staley Manufacturing Corp., establishing a factory in Spain under the company of Sisma, producing soy and sunflower derivatives. Agustin Escagedo Garcia passed away in Madrid, July 23, 1990. Eloy J. Escagedo Lliraldi was born in Aguada de Pasajeros, Las Villas, Cuba, November 14, 1942. He was the only child of Eloy Escagedo Valle and Ramona Facunda Lliraldi Alvarez. His parents were owners of a store called La Francia. Eloy grew up happy, going to school, and had many friends. At 18 years old, when the revolution took control of the island, Eloy was interrogated, beaten, and arrested on various occasions by the police and militia. Due to this, his parents sent him to Miami, Florida in 1962 at 20 years of age. In that same year, Eloy enlisted in the United States Army. He trained in Fort Jackson, South Carolina, graduating in 1963. He was sent to Fort Knox, Kentucky, along with other soldiers that were Cuban exiles. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was stationed in Central America. After finishing his services, Eloy lived and worked in Miami, and in 1966 became involved in a plot along with other exiles to launch an invasion of Haiti. The idea was to topple the Valle and obtain support for an invasion of Cuba from Haitian shores. The operation was called Project Nassau, but the real name was Operation Istanbul. This operation was carried out on a property with a house by a pier in Coco Plum Beach near Marathon in the Florida Keys. The invasion was funded in secret through various sources as well as a government agency. 4 ships were at their disposal along with pistols, rifles, machine guns, mortars, rocket launchers, and they were stocked with 71,812 rounds in ammunition. On January 1, 1967, another government agency arrested the conspirators that included 80 people, Cubans, Haitians, and Americans, all dressed in military camouflage and carrying various types of small sidearms. The jail at Key West could not hold all the prisoners, so 23 of the leaders were sent there and the rest were sent to Miami. Later they were brought before a judge who ordered the release of all the men. Eloy continued in Miami, and his parents, Eloy and Ramona, arrived in March of 1968 on Flight 1183, one of the Freedom flights. Eloy already had an apartment ready for his parents where he drove them to directly from the airport. He always said with pride that his parents never had to sleep on a sofa in other people's homes. 3 days after arriving in Miami, Eloy Escagedo Valle left his apartment early in the morning. As the hours passed, his family became worried and his son went out to look for him. Eloy's disappearance was due to him getting on a bus on Flagler and 11th Avenue that would bus people wanting work picking tomatoes. On another occasion, Eloy was seen washing cars on the corner of Flagler and 11th Avenue. After a short time, Eloy was called by José Pepe Ortega to work for him. Ortega was the owner of warehouses located in front of the Catholic Church back in Aguada de Pasajero. So Eloy began to work at Pepe's grocery store in the city of Hialeah. When Ortega closed his store, Eloy went to work at La Rampa Supermarket on Northwest 27th Avenue as the store manager. He remained at La Rampa until his retirement. In those days, Eloy's son, Eloy Escagedo Lliraldi, met Berta Maria Gutierrez, a beautiful young blonde. Eloy and Berta's mothers both worked together in a clothing factory, and they met when picking them both up at work. Berta Maria Gutierrez Jimenez was born in Colón, Cuba, May 13, 1951. Her parents were Luis Gutierrez Jimenez and Águeda Jimenez Hernández. Berta had one sister, my aunt, Maria del Carmen. On the paternal side, their family were from Malaga, Andalusia, Spain, and on the maternal side, they were from the Canary Islands, Spain. The Gutierrez Jimenez family, like many others, left Cuba for Miami in the 1960s. In Miami, Eloy and Berta soon became engaged and married on August 14, 1971, at St. Peter and St. Paul's Catholic Church. Eloy bought a house with a veterans loan located in the city of Sweetwater in Dade County, Florida. The city was small then with about 3,000 residents, not too many houses or buildings, and people would ride horses down the street on weekends well into the 80s. On March 31, 1975, Berta and Eloy had their only child, Eloy Escagedo III. In 1976, Eloy and Berta went on vacation to Panama and Colombia. They also vacationed in the Dominican Republic and Mexico. Eloy continued his fight in the pursuit of a free Cuba while in exile. He set up a radio station in his Sweetwater home, Radio Antorcha Martiana, KB4AL, broadcasting counter-revolutionary and patriotic programming to the island. About 1979, with the help of other amateur radio clubs and Cuban exiles in Miami, Eloy organized a container shipment to Nicaragua, loaded with supplies, beds, toys, for orphans of Father Fabreto. Eloy traveled with others to Nicaragua to meet with Father Fabreto and supervise the delivery. Starting in 1980, Berta founded a women's group called Women of Sweetwater and Community Action. She was the president, and the group sponsored and organized charities, art shows, sidewalk festivals, and poetry readings, which were the first of their kind in the city. Through their efforts, they were able to bring Sweetwater its first public school, Sweetwater Elementary. Berta was also a columnist writer for Periodismo Libre and Panorama News. In 1981, Eloy created and published a recurring bulletin called Circuito Sur in the United States and Cuba, which was distributed by mail and later via the internet. The bulletin gathered the most comprehensive list of deaths due to the communist regime in Cuba, and included many articles about politics, human rights, and letters from Aguadenses in exile. And for years he collaborated with the Municipio de Aguada de Pasajero in exile. In 1982, Eloy was arrested for unlicensed broadcasting from his Sweetwater radio station. In 1983, he published his novel La conciencia también es gris, el día que los Estados Unidos fue agredido. Translated, The Conscience is also gray, the day that the United States was attacked. In 1984, to live out their retirement, Eloy's parents moved to Sweetwater and into the house they built next to that of their son. In 1987, Pope John Paul II visited Miami and held Mass across from Eloy's house at the Tamiami Park near Sweetwater. For the occasion, Ramona made a large Cuban flag from the fabrics cut by her son Eloy, and then they hoisted it on the property to draw attention to the Cuban cause. They were also interviewed by journalists who were covering the Pope's visit, and the story was published in the papers. Berta, along with her mother Águeda, mother-in-law Ramona, and son Eloy, attended the Pope's visit. In the afternoon it began to rain heavily, and the crowds began their exit. The family walked back to Sweetwater soaked in the rain. In 1990, broadcasting again from his Sweetwater home, the FCC closed his radio station for the last time, confiscating his equipment, and he was fined $1,000. Eloy continued his work for years, actively documenting the victims of the repressive Cuban government, contacting and interviewing people, as well as participating in the Cuban exile community of Miami. On July 7, 1990, Luis Gutierrez Jimenez passed away, accompanied by his family. On August 29, 1992, Eloy Escagedo Valle passed away, accompanied by his family. On March 28, 1998, Berta Maria Gutierrez Jimenez passed away, accompanied by her family. On July 5, 2008, Ramona Facunda Lliraldi Alvarez passed away in her Sweetwater home, accompanied by her son and grandson. Eloy Escagedo Lliraldi passed away on April 2, 2009. He was accompanied by his son Eloy Escagedo Gutierrez at his home in Sweetwater, Florida. Eloy fought his whole life in the defense of freedom, human rights, and for the liberation of his country.